Hi, everyone. This is Dorcas Chang-Tozen, editor with PAX. We are currently in a story arc on mental health, and we are focusing on mental health as an integral part of who we were created to be, as part of the sacred image of God that we each embody. We're looking at how to prioritize mental health, as well as the challenges and barriers, both within the church and within our cultures and families that may prevent us from seeking help when we need it. We are now in the mid-path point of this story arc, which means that we are trying to break down the false beliefs that keep us from acknowledging our needs, that keep us from seeking help and having compassion for others who may be struggling. I have the privilege of speaking today with George Jung. George is a licensed professional counselor in the state of Illinois. He currently serves as the multicultural BIPOC clinician at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. George received a dual MA in mental health counseling and theological studies from Trinity International University. And he also has a bachelor's in youth and family studies from the University of Northwestern St. Paul. And prior to working in mental health, he served as a youth pastor for several years. I'm going to be speaking with George today about the cultural and societal barriers to mental health and what it looks like to seek help, especially for people of color. So George, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Dorcas, for having me. I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely. I'd love to start with just some background about you so we can get to know you a little bit. Tell us, why did you decide to become a therapist, and how did your family and your larger community respond when you made that decision?
Yeah, so culturally, I'm Hmong, and so was born and raised in Minnesota, St. Paul area, and I first had my initial calling into vocational ministry when I was 12. And so at a very young age, I knew I wanted to be a pastor. Had a lot of experiences growing up, kind of doing leadership things and kind of throwing myself at any opportunity to hone my pastoral skills. And by the age of 19, I was pastoring a youth group. And so shortly after graduating, I started full-time in ministry, and very quickly kind of felt the need to go back and get some more training and educate myself in order to really address some more doctrinal and theological issues. And that's how I found myself at Trinity here in Deerfield, Illinois. And 3 months into the program, this is the part where my wife was probably the least happy about this change that I made, because I initially went there for my MDiv. But I had a conversation with her, and it was probably like 11, 12 at night. And we were like, okay, I don't think I'm supposed to be in the MDiv. And she's like, we moved out here for the MDiv. And so she was like, you're not changing programs. And I was like, the Lord's, I think, leading me in a different direction. And the big part of it was really just recognizing that the vocational call to ministry is always going to be there. I'm very much a pastor still, but there was a part of me that, one, recognized that getting a master's degree was going to require me to take out loans. And typically serving in second gen or immigrant church settings, there's not a lot of opportunity to be paid for the education that you get. And so I thought to myself, okay, how do I make a tent making job out of the skills that I have and still be able to be pastoral, but make money on the side so that the church doesn't have to foot my bill. And so that was the initial kind of direction that I took coming into my seminary program. And then once I got into the studies, like it was a match made in heaven. It was everything that I was looking for in my equipping, and with some bumps and bruises here and there while in the program. Got diagnosed with ADHD, and that was life-changing. And so I think moving in that direction, though, a lot of my family was like, wait, what are you doing? And what is mental health, and what
Mm,
do you mean you're changing your direction? Does this mean you're not going to serve in the church anymore? Um, and just answering a lot of those questions around, well, if you're still going to be counseling, why don't you just stay a pastor?
yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think kind of throughout the past few years, they've kind of really grown to understand the work that I'm doing, just
Mm,
through conversations that we've had, and have seen even the need for themselves to go and get work done in therapy. And so that's been a blessing, as well. But there's
yeah.
definitely still a big stigma and a big question mark around what mental health is and why I'm in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've been on a really remarkable transformational journey. But that last point you made, I'd love to continue to talk about that, which is, for people of color, what are the types of messages about mental health
Mm.
that we may be hearing in our families as we grow up? And what types of messages about mental health are we hearing in our churches?
Yeah, yeah. So I think one, there's very little that we hear in
Yeah.
immigrant church settings in particular. And I think partially because the resources and the representation really doesn't exist.
Mm,
And that's not to say that we don't have brothers and sisters of color who are in mental health, but it's very few and far and in between. And so it's kind of difficult to address mental health when it's not really represented within the church. We don't necessarily hear or see of, especially in my settings, people of color who are in therapy, who are providing mental health services. And so I think that's really a big block to our abilities to even
sure.
explore what mental health looks like. But I think too, kind of just the typical stigmas of mental health is for crazy people, right?
Hmm.
Therapy, seeing shrinks
Yeah,
is for crazy people, and if you're not crazy, then you don't need to worry about it, right?
right.
um, or that it's, you know these are personal issues that we have to deal with, and if you really have these concerns, keep it within the family. Come and talk
Hmm.
to your parents, talk to your aunts and uncles, get your family to share with you first. And going to see someone professionally, like, we don't want our family stuff to get out, right? And so
Yeah.
there's that shame aspect,
Hmm.
and it really keeps people from wanting to, um, in an Asian sense, right, dishonor the family by
Right.
spilling the beans, right? And I think that too becomes a really big obstacle for a lot of people.
Hmm. Yeah. Uh, well, you kind of jumped ahead to something we were going to discuss later, which is this question of the honor shame cultures
Mm,
and these collectivist cultures where you have a number of people from different backgrounds, different countries, who may be growing up in families where this is really, really important. And so how do we address this in terms of, if it's somebody who's really struggling with mental health, but they don't want to bring that shame to their family,
mm.
they don't want to upset their family members, what would you say to them? What advice or encouragement would you offer to them in terms of how to address their mental health needs?
Right. Yeah. I think partially, when we recognize that we come from very communal, very familial type cultures, that it's very difficult to step into spaces of differentiation. And what I mean by that is separating ourselves from our parents' emotions and our parents' expectations, separating
Mm-hmm.
ourselves from this idea that our choices that we make personally, right, have a greater impact to the community around us.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's not true, right? But I do think at times that can be weaponized against us
Mm-hmm.
to keep us in a place where the other person feels more comfortable,
Hmm.
even though we might still be struggling and
Yeah.
suffering, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Uh, and so we really have to recognize, one, that if our family or our community is for us, right, and if they really love and care for us, they wouldn't want us to be in the situation that we're in, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
we're struggling with depression, if we're struggling with anxiety, um, they don't necessarily want us to be there. They're just uncomfortable with the thought of something being shared that might cause them shame or might bring them some sort of judgment, right?
Yeah.
And that's really difficult, and it's hard to convince them otherwise, right? But the best part about therapy is that everything's confidential, right? And so unless, in most cases, unless you're at risk of harming yourself, at risk of harming someone else, or if there's any child or elderly abuse being reported, everything remains confidential.
Right.
Right? And so you can share with your loved ones that none of this is going to get out, right? And that this is really work that's needing to be done so that you can really find health for yourself, and be able to process through whatever season of life you're going through better.
Right. Right. So speaking against the stigma, as well as trying to address the real fears that they may have, and trying to help your parents or your family members understand that the fears they have will probably not be realized, and that you, and hopefully even your family as a whole, may be healthier because of your choice to seek help.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So another thing that you had mentioned earlier was lack of representation. And I wonder if that is related to some of the disparities that we see in mental health. So a number of studies have shown that people of color tend to access mental health services at far lower rates than our white counterparts. There was one study done by the Substance and Mental Health Services Administration that found that in the past year, about 16.5% of whites had accessed mental health services, and then 15.5% of Native Americans had. But then the numbers begin to drop quite significantly, and we have 8.6% of Blacks, 7.3% of Hispanics, and only 4.9% of Asians choosing to access mental health services. And the statistics are fairly similar when you talk about psychiatric medication prescriptions. And so can you talk more about this? Why do you think these disparities exist? And what are the greatest barriers for people of color who are seeking help for their mental health struggles?
Yeah, I wish there was a simple answer to this, but there are so many layers to these disparities, right? We can look at socioeconomic disparities, right? And so the resources that are being funneled into those communities, and what it looks like for them to be able to also trust that those help-seeking behaviors are actually going to be of benefit and aren't actually going to bring more harm, right?
Yeah.
And so when we look at individuals who are in those lower socioeconomic settings, right, there's also the concern around how the state or how these resources might view their parenting, might view the social economic living styles that they have, the cultural pieces around discipline, and those are real fears that I think a lot of parents have within these communities, and also that their children end up having, because they're not wanting to get their parents in trouble either, right?
Sure.
And so there are those aspects that can really impact the amount of usage around mental health services. Like we had said earlier, the representation piece. I went into my program and there was probably three or four other students of color.
Wow.
In the program, and the number of students that end up finishing that program as well, right, drops off because of the lack of representation, the lack of understanding of how to apply mental health into their specific context. And that was something that I struggled quite a bit with. And so it really is difficult to find individuals who are trained and who are working professionals in the field. And the biggest thing I think for individuals of color, right, is we look at the person sitting across from us in the room and we ask ourselves, are they really going to understand?
Yeah.
Right? Are they going to get my story? Am I going to have to teach them about my long cultural history before we can actually get work done?
Right.
And that's definitely, a struggle in which most people are like, it's not worth the trouble, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if I can't get in, then, I'll just keep doing what I'm used to doing, right?
Yeah.
And so that's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
that's a
you
big part of
mentioned
it.
a number of those fears of, am I going to be judged? Am I going to be somehow critiqued or even condemned for the way that I raise my family or the kinds of conditions that we live in? Are those legitimate fears or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think um, to an extent that we actually can validate those fears, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we look at the way that society is developed and the structures are created, even in a lot of mental health training, right? A lot of this is white male normative
Yeah.
based, right? And so if your family doesn't look like a healthy white American family, right, there are concerns, right?
Yeah.
And if that's the standard that you're being held up to, then there's going to be tons of fear and concern around um, what your cultural, upbringing and circumstances might mean in light of that standard that you're being held up to. So I think there is some way to validate that, but at the same time, we want to really be aware of and concerned about any situations where abuse is happening, right?
Sure.
Because even though it may feel culturally appropriate, right? I mean, um, almost any minority that I've spoken to talks about how they've gotten physically disciplined
Sure.
some way or
Yeah.
another, right? And culturally, there are different specific items that are used within the
Mm-hmm.
household to
Yes.
to provide that discipline, right?
Can relate. Yeah.
And so there's to an extent a shared experience in that, right?
Yeah.
But to what extent is that then viewed as abusive in these other, white normative standards? Right, and so there's all those concerns, and so I don't want to negate that those things happen. I also want to bring awareness to when it is abusive, when it is going beyond the extent of just simply discipline, when there are social economic situations that need to be addressed so that
Mm-hmm.
a child can be taken care of in the way that they need to be so that they can fully function in society. Like those are important things to also address, and not to invalidate our experiences, but to recognize that we really have to work towards a better way of living, a better um, you know um, experience of life, so that it's not either or, right, that we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to battle with when it comes to seeking out help.
Yeah. Are you finding that there is movement or progress in terms of greater representation of therapists of color, mental health professionals of color, uh, in your field? Are there more and more people that folks could potentially look to for help and as role models?
Yeah, I really do think that there are, and there are a number of groups that are being started and created on Facebook, a number of communities of counselors and therapists who really want to develop a good network of um, awareness around who's where and what services are being provided where, and so there is a significant growth that is happening. I
That's
think
great.
it's just been over the past 10 years that that this movement really has been growing. And so
Mm-hmm.
hopefully as we continue to develop and train individuals of different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds, we can really help ourselves to then represent to the communities that are needed. um, I will say the biggest concern that I have, and that I think a lot of therapists of color have, is when you're in your community, though, it's very difficult to provide services because, especially in like Asian American culture or communities, for instance, because everything is so communal and because
Yeah.
everything is so familial, right? the difficulty of providing services for among community where everybody knows each other, right,
Sure.
becomes kind of sticky.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you always have the confidentiality piece, right? But again, the stigmas and the concerns around who finds out and who knows who's going where and who's seeing who's therapists, right? And so this is why we kind of need more and more therapists to be trained up so that we can actually provide that kind of representation without so many of those concerns as well.
Right. And so potential clients can also have more options, right? More therapists to choose from. I want to switch a little bit and talk about a different demographic, which also is significantly less likely to seek help for mental health challenges, and this is men. So there was a large survey done by the Mental Health Foundation that found that men with mental health problems were 50% more likely than women not to seek help. And they were also far less likely to even tell their friends or family that they were having mental health struggles. 1/3 of men waited for more than 2 years to say anything to anyone, and some of them didn't say anything at all. And so thinking about this particular group of men, and especially men of color, what are the cultural messages and expectations that can make it harder for them to admit that they are struggling with their mental health and to seek help for it?
Yeah, this is a really big demographic of individuals who I think socially have been shaped and informed to live in accordance to whether it's toxic masculinity, machoism, kind of being taught to just suck it up. And, I think what we have come to recognize in a lot of these statistics is one, asking for help isn't really a thing for men to do, right?
Yeah.
We jokingly see the stereotypes in movies, right? And the age old, why can't men just ask for directions, or why can't you just get someone to help you with that? And it's partly a pride thing, right? We kind of develop in ourselves a sense of pride that we can do it on our own. We also have that judgmental aspect of the shoulds, right? I should be able to handle this. I should be able to manage without asking for help. And then, I think the emotional side of it as well, right? Where young boys are told, don't cry, right? Don't show any emotions. Being vulnerable makes you weak, makes you vulnerable, right? To other people in the ways that they might use your emotions against you. And so those pieces are all difficult messages that we're kind of in this generation trying to swing away from, right? But for so long that's been the message, right? And so part of this is generational, in recognizing that these messages have been repeated time and time again for many generations, and then how that gets communicated to the next generation. And so there's that piece. I think additionally, we do what we see done before us, right? And so if our dad had issues but he never asked for help, we're more than likely not going to ask for help when we need it. And then I think too, just the social weight of, if I do need help, how are other people going to see me in that light? Am I going to be reliable in the leadership roles or the situations that I'm called to lead in? Am I, going to be a good husband, a good father, if I can't keep it all together? So there are a lot of those struggles, and I think just being comfortable with being able to say I do need help really is the first hurdle to get over, and kind of letting our pride go and saying I can't handle this, and it's okay.
And that's a big first step. That's not easy.
Right.
Well, and what you're saying also reminds me of how we all have some part to play in perpetuating messages that are either healthy or not healthy, that attach a stigma to mental health or don't, and thinking about how we operate as parents, as friends, as coworkers, as neighbors, right? There are people that we all come into contact with, and what we say about mental health, about ourselves, about others, it definitely is heard. People are listening to that, and that's shaping how they see things and how they might choose to respond if they ever find themselves in a place of needing help. And so it makes me wonder, what can each of us do? I think especially as people of color in communities of color, how can we better support one another and our communities in promoting mental health and in destigmatizing the act of seeking help?
Yeah, I think firstly, the best thing that we can do is give it a try ourselves.
Mm,
I really love pushing mental health as a preventative care service rather than a responsive service to crises or emergencies.
sure.
And so even if you feel like there's nothing to work on, that you're, functioning well and you're, you know, okay with life, give yourself the opportunity to just go and see a therapist and
Mm-hmm.
get the experience so that when there is
Mm,
an opportunity for you to say, hey, I think this is a situation where you might benefit from going to therapy, you have the experience to back that up and
yeah.
not just, lip service to saying, I don't want to deal with your issues, go and talk to someone else, right? But
Mm-hmm.
there's actual connection and understanding around what the experience is like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the first question is going to be, well, I don't know what to expect in therapy.
Yeah,
And so
sure.
if you can kind of ease them into that space, you can help them to understand, oh, the experience isn't as scary as I thought it was, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so getting your own services done, working on yourself in therapy is really the best step that I feel like most people can take. I want to kind of circle around to the representation piece and kind of help us to all understand as well that even though we may end up working with a white therapist or a therapist of a different culture, that the hope is that they've been trained with the understanding that cultural competency isn't, I know your culture and your people and
Mm-hmm.
I can help you navigate,
Right.
but that there's this cultural humility and understanding that I may not understand everything about your culture,
Mm-hmm.
um, and there may be some concepts that that I share with you, some interventions that I share with you that may not fit your situation perfectly, but I'm here for you, right?
Right.
And every
Right.
therapist is in that space of wanting to help you get better, wanting to provide whatever help that they can to address your mental health concerns, your current situation.
Right. So we shouldn't necessarily close the door on
Yeah.
somebody who doesn't look like us, but to be open to the possibility that they could still be a really great therapist, as long
Mm-hmm.
as you said, they understand what they know, what they don't, and they're willing to just be in with you in your situation and to really hear you and understand where you're coming from and what you're experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So let's go back to one of the places we started, which is the church. So for those of us who follow Jesus, who attend church, you were saying earlier that it just mental health just isn't really talked about in churches. And so if we were to talk about mental health more within the church community, what messages do you wish that pastors, church leaders, and others would say, so that we can building a healthier perspective on how to value our mental health and how to take care of ourselves and one another in that regard?
Yeah. Yeah. I think very similarly to my answer in the last question, pastors go and get therapy. go. You are dealing with way too much. The
Yeah.
pandemic was way too much. And all the changes that you're having to face, all of the situations that you're being presented with, it's too much for you to bear by
Mm.
yourself and come out healthy. So go and get therapy, go and find someone. It's confidential. So whatever concerns you have about different frustrating congregation members,
Yeah.
it's all confidential.
Yes, they're not
You
gonna know.
can, right, you can vent as much as you want. But it's also a space where I think a lot of pastors actually burn out, and
Yeah,
we've
absolutely.
seen an increase in a number
Mm-hmm.
of pastors who leave the ministry for good, who
Mm.
are committing suicide.
Yeah.
Several pastors, big pastors in the community, have committed suicide over the past year, and uh, you know, there's this real need for mental health to be addressed within the church. And so, pastors, you can do well in serving yourself by getting these services. I think too, there's this message that we grow up with, maybe not in every church, but in a large number of churches, where we're being told that emotions aren't good. We're being
Mm.
told that
Yeah.
emotions shouldn't be listened to and shouldn't be trusted. And to some extent, yeah, we get that emotions change. We get that we're broken and emotions can't always be trusted. Um, but it's not completely true in the sense that when we're in relationship with the Lord, when we're trusting God and His Holy Spirit, that His Holy Spirit moves and convicts through
Mm-hmm.
emotions, right? When we see
Yeah,
injustice and
sure.
our spirit is upset at that, like, we move because the spirit is moved, right? And so we can't say that emotions are bad just because sometimes they make us make mistakes, right? But if we can actually learn to engage with our emotions in a healthy way, if we can learn to tie that into the ways that the Holy Spirit moves in us, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a perfect match there to
Mm-hmm.
really say, I can trust my emotions because I'm in line with the Lord. I can trust my emotions because the Holy Spirit is moving me in this way.
Yeah.
Um, and so to make emotions a lot safer for everyone, to recognize that we don't have to necessarily be in a space of judgment when people feel certain things. We don't have to
Mm-hmm.
judge ourselves when we're angry, when we're feeling frustrated. Um, but we can relate to our emotions more healthily
Mm-hmm.
through this work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that in and of itself is a framework that is far more healthy, right? If we can name our emotions and acknowledge them and recognize that they are part of who we are, and that God can speak to us through our emotions, can work through our emotions. And I think also in concert with what we've been talking about of working with the therapist, working with the counselor, having mentors, pastors, uh, those having wise folks around you to help you
Mm-hmm.
kind of process through your emotions and understand, when is it an emotion that I should really be paying attention to and acting on? When is it an emotion that maybe I need to work more on managing?
Mm-hmm.
But to just at least acknowledge that it's there. It's part of who we are as human beings. It's part of who God made us to be. And so it is not
Mm-hmm.
something to be buried, but something to be really recognized.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, George, I would just like to ask you if you have any kind of last words of encouragement or advice for anybody out there who may be watching this and feeling like they're just in a really hard place right now and they don't quite know what to do. What would you say to them?
Yeah. I remember being, oh, how old was I? 18. First year of my undergrad, and really feeling gung ho about taking those first steps to being a pastor. And a word came to me, and I wrote my first blog post about it. I can't find it anymore, but it was along the lines of understanding that we may feel hopeless, but we're never without hope.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the situation may feel like it might never change, but we don't have to sit and live in that space if we're not wanting to. And so if you're in a place where you are struggling, in a place where you feel like change can't happen, know that we serve a God that is able to make anything happen, right? That we are sons and daughters of the Most High, and that He loves us and He sees us, and He cares for us, right? Jesus constantly is reminding us to take on His yoke. He's reminding us to cast our cares onto Him because He cares for us, right? And this isn't to provide platitudes in the sense that things are going to be better, right? Things are going to be okay. You can tough it out. But it's to recognize that if your load is too heavy right now, to understand that you don't have to bear that by yourself, and to understand that you have resources around you to really help you navigate how to carry that load, how to let things go. And so those resources are there. And again, this is like the big part for leaders in our communities is, if you're a pastor and you don't have a network of counselors that you feel confident about referring out to, that needs to be your number one priority right now. If you're a leader in your community and you don't know where your mental health resources are, the people who may be able to be representative of your community, or just people that you trust to provide services to your community, like that needs to be your number one priority right now. Because if we as leaders aren't in a place of recognizing the needs of our community, it really leaves us with having to find those who have who have lost hope, right? In dire situations that could have been addressed sooner. And so for anyone who's listening, know that there's a prayer that goes out for you every night, in that the Lord is meeting you and is providing for you a community, is providing for you someone to hear your struggles and to work through those with you.
Amen. That hopeful message is super important. I think it has been a really, really hard couple of years for many of us, and we all need to be reminded of that. So thank you very much, George. And I really thank you for your time, for being with us, for sharing your wisdom and insight and experience. So thank you so much to George.
Absolutely.
John. And thank you, PAX family, for joining us for this great conversation about mental health.